draft for property management, which I will go over today. There is a form called the extension of lease form. Sometimes when the lease is about to end, and if you do not sign any kind of extension, the default provision in the lease agreement makes that lease a month-to-month lease. So if you have signed a one-year lease and neither the landlord nor the tenant sign an extension of the lease, then it automatically defaults into a month-to-month lease. Okay, but if you don't want a month-to-month lease, you want to extend the lease out, this is the form you are going to use. You fill out the top portion like you normally do, and then the extension, it says here the scheduled termination date is extended, so you extend it to whatever date you want to extend it to. Let's say you extend it for a year. Okay, and then you can specify the new rent amount if you're going to change the rent, and if you're going to increase the security deposit, you will specify here. And if you have additional terms, you go ahead and state your additional terms. For example, if there's something that you want to change from the old lease, you can change it here. So it serves not only to extend the lease, but also to change the terms of the lease. And then you get the tenant to sign and the landlord to sign. After both persons sign, you save it in your folder. So that's an extension of lease form. Okay. And there's another document. It's called the tenant estoppel certificate. When do you need to use a tenant estoppel certificate? You need to use a tenant estoppel certificate whenever a buyer opens an escrow with your property owner. In other words, when your property owner is selling his property, one of the things that your seller may need to provide to the buyer is a tenant estoppel certificate. So why would a buyer want a tenant estoppel certificate? The buyer wants a tenant estoppel certificate because the buyer does not want to get involved with the dispute with the tenant over the terms of the lease or the amount of money that the landlord has previously collected from the tenant. For example, if you do not have a tenant estoppel certificate, and if you only rely on the lease, now if the lease says tenant's supposed to pay 2 months of security deposit, and the landlord may or may not have collected 2 months of security deposit, then if you do not have a tenant estoppel certificate, there may be a dispute between you and the tenant over the amount of security deposit actually collected. There may be other things to the lease that don't appear on the lease. However, it could be an oral agreement between the landlord and the tenant. So unless you have the tenant sign an estoppel certificate, you may or may not be aware of any such oral agreements that the tenant had with the landlord. For example, there may be a situation where the lease does not allow a tenant to do certain things. For example, the lease says no pets, And then when you see a pet in the apartment and you don't have a tenant estoppel certificate, tenant is saying that, well, when I was here, the landlord made an exception. But you're looking at the lease, it says no pets. So now you're going to have a dispute with the tenant. So you don't want any of those things. To prevent any of these things from happening, you have the tenant, if you're the buyer, you have the tenant submit an estoppel certificate. As a real estate agent who might be listing the property for sale to the buyer, it is usually the listing agent's job to get the tenant estoppel certificates from the tenants. So if you're selling a 10-unit apartment complex, as a listing agent, you need to get a tenant estoppel certificate from each tenant. Now, as you can see on number 1, it makes the tenant indicate the date of the lease according to the tenant, name of the landlord, name of the current tenant, current base rent, monthly base rent, and the security deposit, expiration date. These are the basic terms of a lease. Number of parking, number of storage spaces, who pays utilities, and who owns what appliances. I think that could be important too. And then anything concerning the lease, that is a modification or amendment to the lease, in accordance with the views of the tenants, must be stated in paragraph 2 by the tenant. And whether or not the tenant has received any free rent or rent abatement has to be stated in here, so the buyer knows. And then the tenant will sign the certificate, which will be acknowledged by either the, which will be receipt acknowledged. That's usually signed by the landlord or the landlord's manager. Okay, in this case, it might be somebody acting on behalf of the landlord, like a real estate agent. So that's how a tenant estoppel certificate is prepared. The question is, what happens if you have a tenant that would not cooperate, that would not provide you with the tenant estoppel certificate? What can you do? Unfortunately, there's not a lot an agent can do if the tenant refuses to provide the estoppel certificate. In many commercial leases, it is built into the lease to prevent this situation from happening. If you have seen some commercial leases where the lease might state that if the tenant refuses to sign a tenant estoppel certificate, then a landlord may sign the tenant estoppel certificate on behalf of the tenant. If you have such a provision, you do not need the tenant's cooperation. You try to get the tenant to cooperate, but if they refuse, as a landlord, you can still sign the tenant estoppel certificate. But that's only available in leases where the lease actually provides for that. The lease says, if within certain number of days after tenant has been provided with the form to fill out the estoppel certificate, and tenant has refused to submit the tenant estoppel certificate to the landlord, then the landlord may complete the tenant estoppel certificate on behalf of the tenant. I do not recall whether the residential standard form has such a provision in the car form, but let's take a look. I don't think it's there. And many commercial leases actually has that provision in there to prevent a situation where landlord is not able to get a tenant estoppel certificate for a prospective buyer. Okay. Let's see if we have it in here. I don't see the rental agreement now. I thought I had it. Okay, well, let me see if I can find it here. Here. I don't think it's in here, but let's take a look. If you look at the month-to-month lease agreement, it doesn't make any mention of tenant estoppel certificate. So you're going to run into a problem with tenant not cooperating in getting the estoppel certificate to you, but there's really not much you can do. All you can do is to tell the buyer what happened, okay? Because there's no such provision in here in the standard residential lease agreement, okay? And we do not see any, oh, there is, okay, number 37. 37 says, tenant estoppel certificate. Tenant shall execute and return a tenant estoppel certificate delivered to tenant by landlord or landlord's agent within 3 days after its receipt. Failure to comply with this requirement will be deemed tenant's acknowledgement that the tenant estoppel certificate is true and correct and may be relied upon by a lender or purchaser. What this means is usually it is the landlord or the landlord's agent who will complete the tenant estoppel certificate in accordance with the landlord or the landlord's agent's understanding of the terms of the tenant estoppel certificate. So based on the understanding of the landlord or the landlord's agent of the terms of the lease, or about what changes have been made to the lease, or any deviation from the lease, from the view of the landlord, the form will be prepared and then it will be provided to the tenant for the tenant's signature. The tenant doesn't always have to agree with the landlord. If the tenant thinks that what's provided on the tenant estoppel certificate is not accurate in accordance with the view of the tenants, then the tenant may make changes to the tenant estoppel certificate and then sign the tenant's name. Whatever changes tenant makes, the landlord may or may not agree with it. But that's something between the landlord and the tenant. However, that is also something that is provided to the buyer. Buyer can decide whether to purchase the property based on the tenant estoppel certificate. So it is actually, there is such a protection here, so we don't have to worry about the tenant not cooperating in providing the tenant estoppel certificate. Okay, so it's good that we have that. All right, let's see what form, what are the forms we omitted last time. We took care of that. Let's look at the move-in, move-out inspection statement. This is the form you want the tenant to complete and sign before they move in. Oh, no, that's not the form. Sorry. I gave you the wrong form. I meant this one. This is what you want the tenant to complete. The purpose of this form, we call this the memo form, is to make sure landlord and the tenant are in agreement on the conditions of the property at the time possession is delivered to the tenant, and also at the time possession is delivered to the landlord when the tenant moves out. So you have the tenant, check the appropriate boxes. The conditions could be new, which is an N, S for satisfactory, O for other, and D for deposit deduction. D deals with a situation where when the tenant moved out and it's discovered that certain things were broken, and it may be involved either a tenant's obligation to make repairs. The tenant can do it himself, or say to the landlord, just make the repair and deduct it for me from my security deposit. So this section is to be completed upon moving in, and this section is to be completed upon move out. So when you do property management, this is a mandatory form to protect the interests of the landlord. There's one other form which we probably did not cover the last time. This form right here. If you are planning to deny the rental application of an applicant based on credit reasons, this is a form that you have to provide to the prospective tenant. You can see that on the form, you can tell the tenant you're rejecting his application based on his income, his employment, his credit history, You know, if the income is below a certain requirement, or the employment is not of sufficient length, he just started his job, for example, okay, or maybe he doesn't have enough credit references, okay. And then you have to decide whether you need to check box E. Box E, most likely if it's based on poor credit, you have to check this box and then tell the applicant which agency provided their credit report. Usually it's all three anyway. And if you have based your decision on the credit score, you're supposed to provide his credit score here. And then usually the credit report will have the range of possible scores, maybe like 500 to 850 you fill out here, okay? And then you have to specify the key factors that adversely affected his credit. Now, usually that can be obtained from the credit report itself, okay? And then the number of recent inquiries on credit report as a key factor. How many places did he make inquiries at? Okay. Now, if the credit decision was based in whole or in part on information obtained from an affiliate or from an outside source other than credit reporting agency, you have to state it here as well. Okay. For example, if you contacted the previous landlord says, this person is not good in making his rent payment. Okay, if it's partially based on that, check it here. Okay, so that's another form that you might have to use in case you have to deny an application. Okay, based on credit reason. And we have I believe there is a couple of miscellaneous forms here. Look at this one here, pool, hot tub, and spa. Then if the property that you're managing has a pool, has a hot tub, or spa, you may have to use one of these addendum. The purpose of this addendum is to provide warning to the tenant about certain negative effect or about the safety or about the legal warnings that you have to give to the tenant regarding the use of pool and hot tub. It's a standard form. All you got to do is just to set it up for e-sign, have it e-sign, and then save it in your file. Okay, so that's the pool and hot tub and spa addendum.